was the story of Donald Webb. He was a low-level mobster who was living in New Bedford. He hung around with some other crooks from Fall River. They were part of what was called, law enforcement called them, the Fall River Gang. And they would do, criminal jobs up and down the East Coast and the Middle Atlantic states primarily, and also in New York. They didn't do as much in their hometown. It was really way out of their area. Well, at one point, Donald Webb was in the small town of Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, which is in the far western part of the state, roughly about 10 hours from New Bedford. And the speculation is that he was scoping out the area for a potential robbery, perhaps a jewelry store. And he was stopped by the police chief of Saxonburg, about a block and a half from the police station. Saxonburg only had 2 police officers. This was in December of 1980, a couple of weeks before Christmas. And a struggle ensued, and the police chief was shot to death, was fatally wounded. And Donald Webb disappeared, drove off, and wasn't seen again by law enforcement. He was on the FBI's most wanted list for decades. And finally, they wrapped up the case and were able to close the case nearly 40 years later. And what intrigued me about the case was how Webb was able to elude authorities, escape detection, because he obviously, we later learned, had some help, and how someone could keep a secret like that for 40 years, for nearly 40 years. It was just a fascinating story of secrets.
Secrets and intrigue and true crime. I'm just curious, what draws you to crime? What draws you to write about true crime? Because you've been a crime reporter for years, so you started that in your 20s, right?
Yep. Yes,
so
I did.
What drew you to true crime? What do you find so fascinating about it?
A lot of it is the mystery of it. I mean, when I was much younger, and even as far back as elementary school, I was reading mysteries. The Encyclopedia Brown mysteries.
Was that your favorite?
That was my favorite then. Way back then, I could just pour through all of those, and the Agatha Christie mysteries, and any type of mystery like that always intrigued me as you try to unravel a crime. And in all of those cases, the ending is tied up for the reader. It's a nice, neat bow. And what I learned covering true crime, real crime in the streets, that isn't how things often turn out. It's very messy. But what is very intriguing about true crime also is what makes people do what they do. That dark side of people, which I still don't understand. And I think a lot of people may be drawn to true crime to try to understand how it happens and what you can do to protect yourself. And there's been a lot of theories out there that one of the reasons why a lot of women will, and particularly, have been listening to true crime podcasts is to find different ways to protect themselves and to learn the lessons of past crimes. That's one theory.
Right. I had read that there's a 2010 study done by the University of Illinois, and they found that women more than men are attracted to the true crime stories. And they want to know, they want to get into the motives of the perpetrator, and they want to know how the victims escaped, if they escaped. And evolutionary psychologists believe that that's exactly what you said, that they want to know how to protect themselves, and they want to understand that good versus evil that's out there.
Yep. And you always pray, really pray that the good wins out, but it doesn't always happen.
Right. So
Unfortunately.
in the ghost, I was wondering, it's an old story, but would things have played out the same way today? I mean, he went undetected for 40 years.
I know it's amazing, and very few people in the greater New Bedford area even knew about him. I mean, the two of us worked together in New Bedford, and I don't recall anyone really talking about Donald Webb or this
No,
case.
he was on the FBI most wanted list,
Yeah,
right?
but
One of
yeah,
the top people.
yeah,
on-
and there was nothing, absolutely nothing. People were talking about his stepson, who was a former New Bedford cop, and he got into um, some issues with the department and later left the department. But people made, if I recall, a couple of people even in the newsroom made in passing, oh yeah, his stepfather killed a police chief, and I always assumed that the guy was in prison. I had no clue that he was still out there. Otherwise, we all would have been doing stories on it. We were young and hungry, and we would have been doing a lot of stories about it.
Can you talk about the process of writing a true crime book and how that is a little bit different than news reporting about crime?
Oh, yeah, it's very, very different. And, a lot of people will say, oh, I could write a book about such and such, or such, this would make a great book. And sometimes you could say, yeah, it would, but a lot goes into it, a lot of research. When you're doing true crime for a daily publication, whether it's a newspaper or radio station or television, you have a certain set of facts and you write about it and it goes on the air or goes online, it goes in print. But when you're writing a longer form, like in a true crime book, it is a whole different process. You need so much more information. You have to get, at least I need to do it this way, get a lot of records, public records, interview people, bring the reader to that scene. Yeah, there's a lot of FOIA requests. Those are freedom of information requests. For every fact that you're writing about, you have to verify it. You can't assume anything, and that takes a lot of time. For example, The Ghost. The Ghost is not a particularly long book, but the amount of research that went into it was really a lot. Because I had,
How many people would you say you?
I interviewed more than 75 people. All of the quotes in the book are either the recollection of the individuals of what they had said at the time, what was in newspaper accounts of what they said at the time, or other official documentation, like tape recordings, things like that, police reports, things like that. So it was a very long process. I mean, I looked up marriage certificates, death certificates, real estate paperwork, corporation paperwork. I, FOIA'd the FBI for records, which is in itself very, very time consuming because you do not get information quickly from the FBI. There's, police reports from out of state, and prison records. All of that was just so very, very time consuming. But thankfully, a lot of people who were there when the police chief, Greg Adams, was killed are still alive. And they were more than happy to talk with me. At least 2 people had extensive scrapbooks from that time. They had some of the paperwork from that time. of the alerts that went out to authorities, thank you notes from other police departments. A couple of the investigators, one from the FBI and one from the state police who were retired, also had extensive records of their own that they were able to, review and talk to me about. So it was just a lot of, I've got at least 4 boxes filled with notes.
One of the things that I'm curious about, so when you choose a story, both of these stories have, they were very traumatic for the families that were involved, for the victims' families. And how do you write these stories without further traumatizing the people involved?
It can be very, very difficult, but I found in both cases, in both books, that the families were more than willing to talk. Part of it may be because a lot of time has passed. The chief's widow, who has since remarried, was more than willing to talk, and she was just a wonderful, wonderful person to talk with. I mean, she was revisiting perhaps the most painful time, well, the most painful time in her life. She was a young widow with an infant child and a toddler at home when her husband was killed, just weeks before Christmas. But they were just at that time just considering, where are we going to spend Christmas with, the in-laws or at home? That was their big question, not whether they were going to be planning a funeral. But she was very, very generous with her time, and just a very lovely woman to talk with. Just as when I was working on Shallow Graves, the families of the victims were also just very generous with their time and very good to talk with. You have to understand their pain and appreciate and be honored that they're willing to share their story with you. Mm-hmm. That's part of it.
And do you think part of the reason why they wanted to talk about these stories in both cases, with the Shallow Graves, with the serial killer, and the ghost, where the police chief is murdered, is it a way for them? I mean, do they feel like sometimes the stories have been forgotten?
For Shallow Graves, there is that sense that please don't forget that this is still a cold case and the killer is still out there and we all deserve an answer. And I am firmly behind that. That has been one of my passion projects, or cases, because it's not a quote unquote project. It is, looking for justice for 11 women, because they have families that are still grieving, and they demand justice. They deserve justice. In The Ghost, what intrigued me was how little we knew here in Massachusetts about the case compared to in Pennsylvania, where it was all over the news. It was a headline all the time for months and months and years and years. And here it was just barely a blip. I went through all the microfiche of the daily papers, of the Standard Times, the Fall River Herald, and the Taunton Gazette, because at that time in 1980, people's reading habits were very, very parochial, especially in southeastern Massachusetts. It was, New Bedford, it was Fall River, it was Taunton, and people didn't read other newspapers. Everything was hyper local, as would be the term now. They weren't big readers of the Boston Globe or the Boston Herald, or maybe the Herald for the comics or the sports, but it was a different time and a different way of consuming news. And there was nothing. There was not a blip. There was, well, I won't say there was nothing. There was one story I found that was in the Herald News of Fall River that was on an inside page by an ad for a restaurant, saying that he was wanted by the put on. He was on the FBI's most wanted list, and then later on there was a story in the Herald News about that the FBI said he was believed to have been seen in the Fall River area. But I went through the New Bedford files and paper in the library and could not find any type of coverage like that, which I found just so troubling. Because I know if I had known about the case, and I feel guilty now also, if I'd known about the case when I was covering police starting in 85, I would have done something on it, and I didn't. And I'm just sort of angry at myself for not knowing about it. And what's interesting is a lot of police officers, particularly younger police officers, both on the state police and local police, they knew nothing about this case. And so they
Why do you think that is? Is that because we were, I know some of it was news, not sharing and reading news from other places, but is it also because agencies weren't sharing information as much back then as they do now? It's not as easy to get into different databases and
there weren't any databases back then like they are now. I mean, there was, computer usage was, a lot of the departments back then were still using Underwoods, or, some of the newer ones had the fancy IBM Selectrics. But that's part of it. And there wasn't social media, there wasn't the internet. People weren't sharing online. I mean, if this happened today, I think Donald Webb would have been found very, very quickly. But
why do you think that? What would have happened differently?
I think the news of that he was from New Bedford, it would have been right in everyone's face because of Google. There would have been alerts of New Bedford, Fall River, and the different news outlets would have picked up on that. New Bedford man wanted for killing a police chief.
So how do you think that this kind of secret, and I know some of it's the news and social media, but this was a pretty deep secret, and how do people keep those secrets?
That's, there's a line that's attributed to Ben Franklin that is that three may keep a secret if two of them are dead. And in this case, as the years passed on, most of the people who knew that Donald Webb was at least in the area had died, but it was a very tightly held secret of where he was. And everything points to that only one person, maybe two, knew where he was all those years. But early on, there was a number of people who knew that he had fled to the New Bedford area. That was pretty clear. That investigators later learned that he was up this way. But I'm still intrigued by how someone could keep that type of secret for all those years.
Right, and the same thing with the serial killer with the shallow graves. That secret is still being kept.
Yes, and that, when that was going on, I thought, it was, and this because you saw how crazy I was at that time, that, I thought the killer is going to be caught, and we're going to be sitting through the trial because no one would harbor a serial killer. No one could keep that type of a secret. And I think that's why a number of people think that, it can't be someone from this area. I believe that the killer probably is from this area, from the greater New Bedford area, are very familiar with the greater New Bedford area. Just because of where the bodies were found, how they were found, it just leads me to believe that it's local. And I was always troubled that someone would keep that secret, that they know who the killer is. And I thought it was really not, it, it couldn't happen again. And then it does with another case. And it's I think it's very, very chilling, especially for a relatively small community in the state, for there to be two very big secrets kept for so many years.
When you're writing about true crime, you're writing about sort of everybody's fears that you could be assaulted, murdered, right? And it just makes me wonder about fears and what are some of your deep fears?
The woods, the woods. I grew up in a city. And you know that I will go any place in a city generally. But if anyone ever says, oh, she decided to take a leisurely walk alone deep into the woods, you know, one, I'm dead, and two, I didn't go there on my own. I do not find the woods relaxing. I do not find that type of thing fun.
So-
There's bugs, there's animals. That is one of my greatest fears, is being in the woods alone. So,
Well, I remember when I bought my house, and
oh, you have to tell this story. This is
rural area, and it's surrounded by woods, and it's just, you know, very quiet and peaceful and idyllic is what I'm thinking. And I bring Maureen out, and she looks around, she's like, no, you can't live here. And she said, you can't see a neighbor. You have to be able to see a neighbor. A neighbor has to hear you when you shout out for help. Yep. But I think that's partly because
but there's also, I checked for your basement, and you had a dirt floor basement there.
There are no bodies in my basement.
Yeah, and the first thing I said to you was, are you sure there's no bodies buried into your house? And there was a bit of an eye roll, I'm sure.
well, that you know, that kind of brings me to my next question. Do you think that because you immerse yourself in these kinds of stories, that it has given you a jaded view of, you know, humankind?
Maybe. Yeah, I like to look for the good in people, but I also know there's a lot of bad out there. So I can be very, very, just a little bit jaded. I am not overly trusting, I'll put it that way. And I do lock my car doors when I'm in the car alone immediately. When I get home, I lock everything and alarm everything. So yeah, I am a little bit jaded in that regard.
Well, I was hoping that you might read us a couple minutes, a section from The Ghost.
All right. This is a section involving the chief's widow, Mary Ann. After her, this is after the death, and as time started passing. The tears came in the quiet of the night, when the children were asleep, when the daily tasks of laundry, cooking, grocery shopping were complete, when the lights were out and the darkness filled the room. It was then that wall of strength crumbled. It was then Mary Ann Adams, alone in her room, felt the empty place in her heart and cried. She made sure the children never saw those tears that first year after Greg's death, or the years that followed. She wiped them quickly away at Sunday Mass when the soulless voice echoed through the church, when the songs hearkened back to the funeral. For her, life was now split between Greg's murder and after. In that blur of year one without Greg, Mary Ann crafted plans in the short term. In the beginning, it was hour by hour, the wake, the funeral, all the other practical details a family attends to after a death. She took baby steps, adjusting at first. Soon she planned a day ahead. Then, by the end of that year, a week. She relied heavily on a calendar, but sometimes even that failed her. Once she made 2 appointments for each of the boys on the same day and time and in different places. The simple holidays, 4th of July, Memorial Day, a birthday, were painful. She found herself thinking back to when Greg was there. She thought about what he was missing. She would feel her eyes mist, and she would blink the grief back. She would look instead at her boys, her gifts from Greg, her anchors. In 1981, the first year after, Lady Diana Spencer married Charles, the Prince of Wales. The space shuttle Columbia was launched. The first American test tube baby was born. The Raiders of the Lost Ark hit the theaters. Betty Davis' Eyes by Kim Carnes was at the top of the Billboard charts. The police television series Hill Street Blues premiered on NBC. Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. The 52 hostages held in the American embassy in Iran were freed. The Pope was shot. Marianne recalls little of what went on outside her world in Saxonburg. Those days were a blur of getting the children fed and clothed, of protecting them, of crying in private, of trying to stay strong. Eventually, she returned to work after a year. At first, it was part-time in computer operations at Duco Ceramics. Then she took a job at an insurance company before joining the school district as a secretary. Over the years, she would accept honors in her husband's name and attend memorials in his honor. Sometimes children, although often it was just Ben those first years, would attend, such as when she received a medal and certificate from the American Police Hall of Fame in Greg's memory a month after the killing. Dozens and sometimes more than 100 Saxonburg residents would come out to mark the yearly anniversary of his death. The town erected a memorial etched with the chief's image in front of the municipal building. When a federal program was signed into law by President Bill Clinton in 1998, providing $25 million yearly for 3 years to help buy bulletproof vests, she was at the local ceremony with both boys, then grown. Pennsylvania U.S. Rep. Ron Klink, who as a television reporter in 1980 covered the murder, spearheaded the original bill. She stayed in Saxonburg for 8 years after the shooting, keeping in touch with her late husband's family, before finally moving on to nearby Cabot, less than 3 miles away. But in those first months and years, her focus was on her boys. She left the investigation in the hands of the police. If there was an update, she knew they would call. When an arrest was made, she'd be in court to see the killer. Until then, she let the police do their work, and she spent her days and weeks doing hers as a mother.
That's just brings it home about how difficult it is. You know, there's a murder.
And
it seems so far away, but it isn't. It's very personal.
it is. And when she was telling me some of the stories, telling me the story of how she learned of that he had been shot, what it was like in that first couple of days and then the weeks, it really was absolutely heartbreaking. And she remembers it so vividly and clearly. And I think for her and all the people in Saxonburg, because it touched so many people there, they kept the memory alive because they were determined to be able to remember what happened that day clearly when the killer came to trial. And you know, that is something that everyone who kept that secret of where Donald Webb was, they have to remember that by doing that, it kept that wound open in the community. We went down to Saxonburg 3 times. twice during doing the research, and then this past summer when the book came out. And the people in town were still wondering why no one up here came forward early on. They just couldn't understand that. And there was a little bit of bitterness, but that is not a bitter town. They're just puzzled by it.
Well, I mean, they were denied justice.
Yes. Yeah.
So thank you for reading that.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if anybody in the audience, if we can open this up to people in the audience, if they have questions, and maybe, so Andrea says, that's not jaded for a woman, that's just smart. You staying out of harm's way. In Shallow Graves and in The Ghost, you humanize the victims and the ones left behind, alone or left to be cared for by grandparents, aunts. And FOIA requests, state by state, costs varies. Did you request FOIA in all states in which Donald was investigated? How are prison files requested? FOIA or prison by prison? I think isn't state by state, each state has its own rules and regs too, right?
Yeah. I had to submit formal requests for prison records in New York and in Massachusetts, and in one of the communities in New York where Donald Webb was wanted at the time of the killing. And that started off with just a phone call, and they say, "Can you put it in writing?" So, and part of that in the town, New York town, was it made it easier for them to look up the records by having it in writing. And of course, with the prisons, they need a formal request to make sure that one, they have the records, two, that they can release them. Unfortunately, I also had tried to get his military records, but it appears that his military records were destroyed at one point in, it was either fire or flood, something like that. But a good part of his military records was included in his prison records, in some psychological files that were in there. So I was able to piece together his prison record along with some news clippings from his earlier crimes in the 1950s.
What kinds of records do you have access to? I mean, a lot of people wonder, they think, oh, you can't get that kind of information, right? But what kind of records do you have access to when you do a Freedom of Information Act request?
Well, he was dead. Well, it was a little bit easier to get his records, but you can't get someone's medical records generally. You can't get, you can't get medical records. There are some school records you cannot get. You can get records, that when someone graduated, but not their grades, unless they release them. Medical records, someone has to release their medical records unless there's extenuating circumstances, or that it was entered into a public record, like a court, a trial. There's an awful lot of things that are public. In Massachusetts, so some things aren't public. But in this case, most of what I was requesting, I was able to get. I wasn't able to get the full FBI file because it was just the cost was prohibitive. But I was able to select it, and the files are outrageously long because it did span almost 40 years. But I knew what I was looking for, so I was able to get certain select records. But it took a while. It took quite a long time.
When you were doing the research for this, were there things that surprised you when you were uncovering records and information?
Yes, Donald Webb's background, his childhood, that surprised me.
Why?
Why? Well, well, in some ways, maybe it shouldn't have surprised me. Perhaps it's that it intrigued me,
Mhm.
and that's why I like looking at into the background of criminals to see uh, where things went wrong in their life. And I think that there's lessons that we could all learn from, the most horrendous of crimes, and looking at the criminal to see, okay, where in their life could they have gone one way or the other? Um, is it, nature, nurture, or is it, what makes people tick? What makes them go the wrong way? And in his case, it was he well he could have gone a different way because he had a brother, and his brother was not a criminal.
Mhm.
You know, not unlike Whitey Bulger. Um, in some ways, Donald Webb is very much like a Whitey Bulger, except he was not, a mass murderer, so to speak. Well, boy, didn't kill a lot of people. He killed one person, but he went. Donald Webb went one way. He had a brother. His brother stayed on the straight and narrow.
Hmm. So I'm curious to know where you're going next. What projects do you have in the works?
I'm working on right now and actively writing and researching a book, another book that's set in Pennsylvania on a 15-year-old girl who went missing in the 1960s, and was finally recovered in the 1980s. And looking at that case and how they recovered her and some of the science behind the recovery.
Mhm. Do you think that you'll ever be writing a, a sequel to Shallow Graves that might actually answer some of the questions that are still out there?
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. I hope to be able to write a sequel where someone is tried, or a sequel where at least we know who the person is. Whoever is, if the killer is dead, we all need to know that, and finally put, and I won't say closure because that's too trite of a word, but to finally have some relief to know that the killer's been identified, and it's not someone who lives next door or down the street, or that weird person that hands you coffee in the morning, or pumps the gas, or is a teacher, or whatever. um, we all need to know who it is. We
So,
deserve it.
yeah. Is there anybody else out there that has a question for Maureen?
That there is a question in the Q&A.
Okay.
It's about Shallow Graves. And Maureen, would you just mind giving us a quick synopsis about what the book is about? Because we didn't really set that up.
Oh, for the ghost? Yeah.
No, for Shallow Graves.
Oh, for Shallow Graves. In Shallow Graves, I traced the case of disappearance of 11 women who disappeared from the greater New Bedford area in 1988. Nine of the women were eventually found dead along highways that circle New Bedford. They were found on 195 in Dartmouth and Marion, which, by the way, that increased the Marion murder rate in that year 100%. They were found on 140 in Freetown and on 88 in Westport. 11, as I said, 11 women went missing. 9 of them were found dead. 2 of them are still missing. The case garnered a lot of information, a lot of attention in late 88, 89, 90. 91, and then it just seemed to have died down considerably. There was a number of suspects that were looked at. One person had been indicted, but the charges were dropped. So it's still out there. And the state police assigned to the district attorney's office is still looking into it. So it's a cold case, but it's not a dead case.
So the question in the Q&A is, I watched the Ripper on Netflix, a documentary on a serial killer killing sex workers in Yorkshire, England, and no one cared until a good girl was murdered, quote unquote, around good girl. And do you think that is or was part of the low profile of the case, the Shallow Graves case, the murders? Do you think that that's part of it? There is a sense that these women were, not in the mainstream, and what happened there? Why wasn't there more attention when all of these women went missing?
Yeah, part of a lot of people like to look for simple answers to this, and there's nothing simple about it. The women didn't go missing all at once. All the women had drug problems, were drug addicted. But it wasn't a matter of that no one cared or that no one was paying attention. There was no indication early on, until the bodies started showing up, that they were abducted or that they were killed. There was no evidence of murder early on. And in some of the cases, not all of them, in some of the cases, the women would take off for weeks at a time. In a few of the cases, the women were never even reported missing. That said, there was several of the women were reported missing within days after their disappearance. And it was because of the women who were reported pretty much immediately that's what caught the attention of law enforcement, that and the discovery of bodies.
There are still some women who are missing from that.
Yes. Yep.
There's
two. And that goes to, there is one line that I often hear, and that is, well, if these women were the daughters of police officers, you can bet there would have been a lot of attention and they would have found the killer. The two women that are missing, one of them is a daughter of a retired New Bedford police officer. And the other woman who is still missing was the daughter, her mother was engaged to a Dartmouth police officer. So there were, police involvement in there. Those that were missing were daughters of police officers. And now that said, a number of people have also speculated why the only two who were tied to police officers, why haven't their bodies been found? And that is also a very intriguing question. Is there a reason for that? Or is it just that they had brought in police dogs to search the highways for victims eventually, and perhaps the dogs missed them, or they were looking in the wrong place?
So there's a question. In The Ghost, could you explain how law enforcement cooperated across various agencies?
That's a good question. In The Ghost, that is perhaps that is a time and a good example of how law enforcement agencies worked well together and to eventually solve the case. At the start of the investigation in Pennsylvania, the FBI agents in Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania state troopers who were investigating the case, they all knew each other and they got along well. There was not that, what you would see in Boston, perhaps that hatred or distrust between the FBI and Boston police that didn't exist in Pennsylvania at that time. And even in New Bedford at that time, the FBI agents that were working in the New Bedford office were close friends with some of the state police that were working the case. So they were cooperating early on. And at the end of the case, it was definitely, the case could not have been solved without the cooperation of the FBI, the Massachusetts State Police assigned to the Attorney General's office, and the state police in Pennsylvania. All of them working together. Each of them had a key role in finally solving the case.
So is there anything else about, I know you don't want to give away the ending,
Yeah.
but is there anything else about the ghost that we haven't touched on that you think, the audience might want to know about?
I think that the audience will find it intriguing how police work back in the 1980s, was how they were able to accomplish so much through just talking to people, knocking on doors, and physically going through records. Because at that time, like I said, there was no internet, and there weren't databases to look up. So I think that I found very intriguing, and it really showed really good police work early on in the case, because they had to identify Donald Webb. When he killed the chief, he left behind a driver's license, and the driver's license had someone else's name on it, and it was a New Bedford, a Massachusetts license, and that's how they were able to. That led to his identification. That coupled with talking to a wide range of people, and who were car rental places and hotels in Pennsylvania, and they were able to narrow down who it was that they were looking for.
This case took several decades to resolve. Was there a particular group of people who kept this case alive all those years, or somebody who followed the case from start to finish, or was it different people in the beginning to the end?
It was different people in the beginning to the end, because over the course of the investigation, people retired, or they were promoted, or went to other units. But the one thing about the FBI, they document everything. So whenever an agent picked up the case, he or she, but it was primarily he, had at its fingertips, so all of the records. And the same with with Pennsylvania. They had amazing records there for the investigators to look back on.
Are people in Saxonburg feeling better about everything with this case?
They're very, very, very relieved that it's finally over. They're relieved that that people know about the case, that they know about the chief. They know that people now know what happened. That it is it's a story that is not just told in their neck of the woods, so to speak. That people in Massachusetts will know what happened.
Well, I can't wait for your next book, and Janet's poking in.
I just I had a question where you've been doing this so long, Maureen. As you've watched, I imagine there's more women in law enforcement than, say, in the 80s. And I'm wondering if that's changed how cases are investigated and how things are approached, and what's different with more women in law enforcement.
That's a really good question. With more women in law enforcement, it allows, particularly female victims, they feel much more comfortable talking to a woman, for the most part. Not in all cases, but women sometimes bring in a different perspective to a case. They may notice something else. I was talking to a retired female state detective about this case in particular, and she offered some unique perspectives to it. And I think that if there had been women on the case, it would have maybe not made a big difference, but it would have helped them maybe break the case sooner.
Mm.
Because everyone brings in their own experiences into, whether it's a book, whether you're writing, whether it's an investigation, whatever job you are doing, you're bringing in your own view. You're looking at it through your own point of view. And that perspective can really be helpful.
So I'm wondering, does anybody else have any other questions out there?
I wondered something as you were talking. You mentioned really briefly that Webb is gone, has died. Can you talk about that a little bit?
No.
Oh,
No,
No spoilers.
no spoilers
oh,
here.
all right. You have to read the book to find out.
Yes.
Okay.
That's still a secret.
But you know what, let's face it, he was an old man. He was well into his 80s. So, well, leave it at that.
Anybody else with any other questions? Maureen, do you have any other, before we close off, do you have any other thoughts?
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight, and thank the library and the library staff for having us. It's been fun. We got to drag Natalie. I'd say drag her out, but she's at home, just like all of us are.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I really appreciate everyone coming out, and there's you can get more if you want to know where else I might be appearing, either for Shallow Graves or for The Ghost. We've got two websites: shallowgravesthebook.com, maureenboylewriter.com. And I've got an author page, and I'm on Twitter, Maureen E. Boyle 1. I'm on Instagram, follow me, chat with me, whatever.
And before we sign off, there's just one last thing. I was wondering, do you have any recommendations for other true crime authors that people might be interested in, or anybody you really admire?
I've been reading the works by Michelle McPhee and listening to her podcast on the marathon bombing, and she's very, very passionate about that, and she's really her passion comes through on that. I've read both of her books on the marathon bombing, both Mayhem, and the other one is Maximum Harm, that's tracing how the Tsarnaev brothers had how did they get here and what led to the bombing. So that's very, very passionate. She's just very passionate with that. Sebastian Younger, I've read some of his stuff, which I find very good. And of course, in fiction, it'd be Hank Phillippe Ryan. It's just a lot of fun to read. It's each of her books gets better and better, and it's just there's violence in it, obviously, because it's a crime. It's not true crime. It's just a mystery, but it's fun. And I have someone writing a. Oh, my husband is like plug Fall River. I was on the epic show Fall River it was on Epics recently about the Fall River cult murders, which was an interesting experience.
Another interesting case, though.
Yeah, very, very interesting case. Very, very interesting case. They come up with some other conclusions that I may not agree with, but but it's interesting what they concluded.
Are you ever tempted to write fiction, or do you find true crime to be so fascinating that that's where you'd like to stay?
Well, that's an excellent question. With the ghost, originally I was going to make it fiction, based on a true story, but fictionalize it. And that way I wouldn't have to do all this research. I wouldn't have to interview 75 plus people. I wouldn't have to do all of this other stuff. And I don't know, I wound up going down that rabbit hole. I am starting a novel, but it's going in all different directions, and I don't know if I should hit delete or not on it.
No, keep going.
Yeah, there's some really good parts of it, and then there's other parts where I got, oh my God, it's going the wrong way. But it helped clear my mind from the ghost.
No, keep going. I want to read your novel.
I just know from writing some history that sometimes I come across historical things that are like, if you ever put that in fiction, people would not believe it. It's just so, far out that it doesn't seem like it could be possible. And I wonder, in all of your years of covering crime, if some of the stories you come across, if you put them in a fictional account, if people would be like, that's not believable.
That's true. There are so many cases where you're like, no, this really happened. And there was a case in Westport that they called the Jello Murder, where the allegation was that someone was murdered, given an overdose of acid to give the guy a heart attack.
Wasn't it arsenic? And the allegations were that the family was putting a little bit in his Jello every night. He loved to have his Jello dessert every night.
Now, what I can't remember if it was arsenic or LSD.
I thought it was arsenic, but my memory's a little fuzzy.
Yeah,
I just
mine is too.
Yeah, I remember it being like green Jello or something like that.
Yes, and there was question of what the big question was, what color Jello was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
that was a weird case.
yeah, there's been a couple of them that the two of us have covered over the years, and people would not believe it. If you put it in fiction, they go, that's totally unbelievable. Well, it happens.
But I do want to read your novel when you pull that off, okay?
Okay, will do. And I'm waiting for yours now.
Yeah, it'll be a bit of a wait. So
she puts on her glasses, and when she says that,
that's it.
Yeah.
So Dot says, many thanks for investigating and presenting these cases. I think that's one of the things that is very important, is that by pulling together these cases, they're not just little bits of news stories here and there. You are keeping these stories alive in a way that is important, for people to know about the highway killer. A lot of people don't know there was a serial killer in New Bedford, and
I find that amazing, as you do too, because you also were covering it at the time. You're very active also in covering it at the time. And when people say, oh, there was a serial killer in New Bedford, like, you want to look and go, where have you been? But there's even some people in the greater New Bedford area who weren't born in 1988 and know nothing about the case, or what they do know is rumor and innuendo, and that's also the other reason why I felt it was important to write Shallow Graves, to have a factual record of what happened.
am I remembering this correctly? But one of the reasons that prompted you to find family begin writing had to do with a student.
Yeah, when I was teaching in one of my journalism classes, I had a student who, she was also my advisee for 4 years, and she was taking a lot of journalism courses. A lovely young woman, and occasionally I would, mention the New Bedford highway killings, or different weird crime cases. And I remember one time she had mentioned that, oh yeah, she had a relative who was in law enforcement, but never went further. And it was probably a couple of weeks before graduation where she was asking me about the case, came to my office and wanted to asking me some questions. And she was quoting something, a description from one of my stories. And I immediately thought of one of the mothers of one of the victims. And I'm like, okay, tell me more. And it turned out that her aunt was one of the victims of the highway killing. And she wasn't even born then when the killings happened, but she wanted to know more about the case. And that was, you realize that there's a whole generation out there of family members who need to know more about the case, who need to take on the mantle of searching for justice and are looking for justice and need answers to the questions of who the killer is. It's always an uplifting, I always give such uplifting talks.
Anybody else have a question out there? Like, why does Kevin have a cat for his
Yeah,
screensaver?
because he, that's what he picks.
But, well, thank you. And thank you, Amy and Janet. And thank you so much, Maureen, for sharing everything with us.
Yep, again, thank you so much for having me. I'm just looking at who is here, and I wanted to say, thanks to everyone on there that I know and don't know. And thank you.
And thank you for coming. And hopefully by your next book, we could actually bring you to Nantucket and do this in person. So we'll shoot for that.
Yes, that will be my inspiration to keep on writing.
Okay, good.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.
I'm watching everyone leaving.
I know they're popping out. Now.
Yep.
I am not a cat. No, really, I'm not a cat. I'm a person.
I want to hear you meow, Kevin.
Yeah.
No, I'm not a cat. I'm a person. I don't know about this filter.
No, that's a line in a Zoom call, a court Zoom call where someone had the cat filter.
Yes, I remember
Oh,
that.
I remember that.
Yes.
What was that?
And
That
he's
was
talking and going, I am not a cat.
Amy, did you stop the stream?
Oh,
My, it's on the YouTube. It's the top right corner.
there we go.